Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, J, your resident troublemaker and your resident culture warrior. I hope you are all doing well, and I hope everybody had a fantastic weekend. I know I had a really good one. We had a good live stream on Saturday. Thank you to everybody who showed up for that. It was really cool. We had a lot of fun. Watched some cool videos. It was good. I liked it. I enjoyed it. I learned some things. Learned some things about like armor and historical armor and stuff like that. So yeah, it was a really cool live stream. So thank you to everybody who participated, and we'll be doing another one this coming Saturday. So I hope to see you all there. Anyway, let's start the week. Okay. Before I do anything, we have to acknowledge you guys are going to be seeing this on Tuesday. I'm actually recording it Monday night, so you guys are going to see it on Tuesday, which at least here Tuesday my time is Valentine's Day tomorrow, right? It's the day of love, the day we celebrate love, Saint Valentine, right? Day we celebrate love. And I just wanted to show you guys something really cool. Like, how do you know when the person that you're with, your significant other, how do you know when they're a keeper, right? Like when they're like a keeper, right? Well, there's a myriad different ways that you'll know, right? And I'm sure experts will weigh in. You know, you'll have all sorts of, everyone from friends and family to, people on YouTube who have entire channels devoted to it, telling you what to look for in that special somebody, right? That will tell you whether or not they're a keeper. In my case, I found my keeper, and that's Mrs. J. But every now and then she'll just do something random that just, I'm just like, yeah, I was right. She is definitely a keeper. So in knowing of what a Tolkien nerd and what a geek I am, she got me this card for Valentine's Day, and I just wanted to share it with you guys because I thought it was like really cool. Totally wasn't expecting it. This is what the front of the card says. Right? It says, it's got there, you see, it's got the even star, right? It's got Arwen's even star, and it says, I would rather share one lifetime with you, right? But then when you open it, it's this whole 3D thing, and it says, then face the ages of this world alone. And isn't that so cool? And it's got like the Arwen and Aragorn silhouette there. Right? Isn't that so cool? So anyway, she got me that and gave it to me. We had a nice little romantic dinner on Saturday. I took her out, and yeah, I just thought that was really cool. That was just one of those things that's like, you know what? That's how you know when your significant other is definitely the one, right? Because they know what's gonna work. They know exactly the things that are gonna get right to you. And I just thought that was really cool. She knows what a big Tolkien nerd and sci-fi fantasy nerd fan I am, and she pardon me, I'm seeing dust or something on my shirt, and she got that, and I just thought that was great. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with all of you folks, and I hope that you and your significant other are going to enjoy and have a beautiful and wonderful Valentine's Day. And I wish the best for everybody. All right, so let's get right into it. We got an interesting article I wanted to talk about because it's a subject that I had touched on previously. And this is coming to us from the folks over at Screen Rant, and says the Rings of Power's massive budget is the show's own worst enemy. Money doesn't solve all problems, and Amazon's The Lord of the Rings of Power is unfortunately a perfect example of why that is true. So let's see what they have to say. Amazon's The Lord of the Rings of Power has a huge budget, and it's potentially put the show at a disadvantage. Of course, every film and television show needs plenty of funding to get made. It's necessary for all projects if they have any chance of being well made and widely distributed. Costumes, sets, actors, special effects, crew members, equipment, and everything else that is an essential part of filmmaking all comes with a cost. With this in mind, it'd be easy to assume that a bigger budget is better. However, there can be too much of a good thing. And yes, as a independent filmmaker, I will speak on this one in a minute. Let's get through the rest of the article. Initially, the show's first season was supposed to cost roughly 100 to 150 million, but the finished product ended up having a price tag near 465 million. It's hard to think of a reason for Rings of Power's ballooning budget other than it being mismanaged. The amount of money spent isn't necessarily the problem. What's worrisome, however, is the willingness to stretch the budget further. It suggests a lack of discipline on behalf of the creative team. There's a debate about whether Sauron or Morgoth is the more powerful villain in Lord of the Rings lore, but Amazon itself might be a worthy contender. Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy proves less is more. There's no denying it. Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy had a huge budget. Filming for the trilogy began in late 1999, with all 3 films being shot together. The budget for the entire trilogy was $281 million, equivalent to $436.5 million in 2020, when The Rings of Power began production. When all was said and done, Jackson's films combined to reach an 11-hour, 26-minute runtime. That comes out to roughly $38.4 million per hour of completed film. Considering the critical acclaim and plethora of awards The Lord of the Rings earned, as well as the universal love and adoration of fans it gained, that's a reasonable price. The majority of the production process on The Lord of the Rings was littered with the need to get creative and solve problems in resourceful ways. The trilogy's budget wasn't flexible. That forced Jackson, his producers, and the crew to stick to it. Cuts occasionally had to be made, and sacrifices were often required. Everyone involved in the project poured their blood, sweat, and tears into the trilogy because it meant something to them. At a certain point, money could no longer be an incentive. Passion often had to pay the bills, and that truth is evident when looking at the finished product. The Rings of Power's endless resources could be the death of creativity. Orson Welles famously said, "The enemy of art is the absence of limitations." Many of the best directors in the film industry would probably agree. Limitations and boundaries demand that creativity and resourcefulness come forward. If challenges don't get met, failure is guaranteed. That is the problem with Rings of Power. Resistance arose and demanded ingenuity, but rather than confronting issues with resourcefulness, Amazon attempted to remove obstacles by increasing the budget. The removal of budgetary constraints only succeeded in guaranteeing the end of passionate problem solving. A lack of boundaries indicates that nothing is at stake. Season 1 of The Rings of Power has a total runtime of 9 hours and 17 minutes, which means roughly $50.1 million was spent for every hour of the show. That's substantially more than what Jackson's The Lord of the Rings cost by comparison, and there's a marked difference in the quality of the two productions. Rings of Power's lore changes, uneven writing, and overly polished look have been criticized, among many other things, while Jackson's films have very few flaws. Unfortunately, no amount of financing can fix The Lord of the Rings of Power's issues. Amazon believes perfection is available for purchase, but reality definitely says otherwise. And I wholeheartedly agree. That is Grant Bullard from over at Screen Rant. I wholeheartedly agree, and I do so as a filmmaker and as a Lord of the Rings fan. So let's get into it. Yes, as an independent filmmaker, one of the things most filmmakers will tell you, especially filmmakers who are starting out or who consider themselves independent filmmakers, right? The concept of an independent filmmaker is you don't have, by default, any sort of studio or production company behind you. You're sort of doing it on your own, okay? And you can have big budget independent films. For instance, one of the most famous original independent films was the original Star Wars, 1977's Star Wars A New Hope. Initially, the only way 20th Century Fox was associated with that was as the distributors. Right, it was distributed through 20th Century Fox, but it was a lot of loans and stuff like that were taken out to finance the original Star Wars. And as most people know, when it came to the visual effects and that, George Lucas literally had to invent industrial light and magic. Right, and a lot of the things that we've come to know today in terms of effects and how they're created were started by Industrial Light and Magic, which in turn was started by Lucas just so he could get the effects done for his own film. Like, that's the very definition of independent filmmaker. And most filmmakers, and myself included, independent filmmakers would agree that when you have a finite resource, like when your finances have a cap, when they have a upper limit, right? When your finances are not infinite and unending, but when there's a finite limit to how much money you can spend, it does force you to solve problems and approach things in a much more creative and resourceful way. It simply does. If I'm writing a film and I have this really great battle scene, but I don't have the money to spend to pay somebody to add 10,000 orcs into it, right? I've got to come up with creative ways, both within the story, within the script, how it's shot, the cinematography, and what effects I can pull off to sort of convey the same message, but perhaps do it in a way where you're not caught up in the spectacle, where you're not seeing an open field like in the Battle of Pelennor Fields with thousands of combatants, right? And by having that limit on a budget, it forces you to do that. It forces you to think outside the box, to be more creative, to be more artistically flexible, and to use your ingenuity and be more resourceful. And a lot of that is missing from Hollywood today, because what you get is you get a lot of, like, what you're seeing with Amazon and the Rings of Power, where whatever the problem is, we just throw money at it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a better product. And the reason why that is because if nobody has to worry about, well, how can we do this? What's the best way to do this? What's the most artistic way we can tell this story, okay, in a realistic fashion? If they do that, and they can turn around and not have to worry about ever having to cut scenes that don't work or so on. You can just do take after take, and nobody's worrying about how much any of this is costing. Then you're sort of losing that creative nuance, right? That sort of ability to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, right? Because you have no reason to. So everything's a keeper, if that makes any sense, right? So there's a phrase in filmmaking, in particularly in editing, that's called it, and I know it sounds weird, so bear with me, please. It's called to off the baby. Okay, I'll just put it that way because I don't want YouTube to sort of flag anything. But off the baby. And what that means is, okay, when you as the filmmaker, the director, writer, whatever, on an indie level, you tend to wear multiple hats. When you're sitting in that editing bay, either as the editor or with the editor, you may have this really, really, really great shot, right? You may have a really great shot, but it doesn't do anything for your story, okay? It doesn't drive the story forward. It doesn't add anything to the story. It doesn't impart any information or any better understanding for the viewer of the characters or whatever, right? It's a pretty shot, but it doesn't add anything. Well, you as the filmmaker are sort of forced to sit there and say, do you off the baby? Because that shot is your baby, right? It's your pretty shot, the shot you just love, right? Because the lighting was perfect, the sunlight looked perfect, everything was perfect about that shot, right? But it doesn't add anything to your film or your show, right? And so you have to ask your question, do you get rid of it or not? Okay, now, if you have constraints on you, like you have a time limit constraint, like your show or your movie can only be so long, right? Or you have budgetary constraints, like, well, I've only got X amount of money left but I still got like X amount of days worth of shooting to do. Then you're sort of forced to ask yourself, do I keep this simply because I think it's pretty? Or do I get rid of it to make sure that there is room for the things that need to be in there, the things that add something to the story, that drive the story forward, that present information to the audience and stuff like that. And sometimes as an independent filmmaker, you're forced to make that decision, okay? And usually in a situation as cut and dry as that, where it doesn't add anything to the film versus a shot, shots that do, you get rid of it in favor of the shots that do add stuff to the story, right? Or that drive the story forward in some way. And it's the same thing with budgets. If you are not forced to make sure that everything that's going into the final output version of your film, right? If you are not forced to make sure that everything that the audience needs to enjoy this world and be brought into this world, if you are not forced to make sure that those are the things that end up in the final cut of your film, and rather you have this open-ended, well, we've got budgets, we can do it until we can keep filming this scene over and over again until we get it as pretty as we want it, right? Even though the previous take may be more emotionally impactful, but the creative team wants to have the more pretty shot, right? And so you have the budget to do that over and over again. Well, and then you're going to start making decisions based on your personal preference, not necessarily what's best for the film or best for the audience or best for the story, right? And filmmakers are aware of this. This happens quite a bit. And that's why you will often see it's the independent films, it's the indie films that have the much deeper, richer story. And they have the much more streamlined methods of storytelling where every scene is imparting information to you as the viewer. Whereas something like The Rings of Power and Amazon, with an unending budget where any problem that pops up, the solution is just throw money at it. What you get is a lot of scenes that don't make sense, a lot of storylines that go nowhere, a lot of things that are in there because they weren't forced to critically look at what's important because the budget is so open-ended, right? They aren't forced to trim off the fat and just give you the meat and give it to you raw, right? And so you get a Rings of Power, which cost ultimately almost twice as much as what Peter Jackson's films cost, but Peter Jackson's films are exponentially better, right? Because like they said in the article, because when you have a limit to what you're able to do, right? The limits on your budget, the limit on your time, right? You are forced to cut out the fat and just go for the important stuff and make sure that that is the best it can be, right? You don't have time for frivolous nonsense. Whereas when you don't have those constraints, you get Rings of Power where you have Galadriel hanging off the side of a horse, nowhere near an orc, but yet somehow the orc just explodes. Why? Because we could afford to do it. Right? So, and there's no checks and balances. There's nobody sitting there going, that really doesn't help the story any. That really doesn't improve anything. We should cut those things for the more important stuff, right? But anyway, what do I know? I'm just, an indie filmmaker and visual effects guy who happens to like Lord of the Rings. How dare I speak on any of this stuff? But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Do you think that it's better to have, sort of limitations that you have to work within when creating something artistic, be it a painting, a song, as a musician or a filmmaker or an artist or an illustrator? Do you think having either a time or financial limitation that you have to work within is better for your art? Or do you think just having this unended, open-ended access to never-ending resources is better? I go with the first one. I think it's better to have limitations there that force you to think creatively, but that's just me. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this one. I will talk to you soon. Remember, if you like the video, give the video a like. If you feel like sharing the video, by all means, do so. It helps us get seen, and it helps us with the YouTube algorithm. And as always, if you have not subscribed to the channel yet, I hope that you would consider subscribing and joining our army of beautiful badasses. And if you are a returning subscriber, thank you very much. I appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this one. Remember, be good, be awesome, be safe, but more importantly, stay more dorkish. Peace.